In Dan Brown's 2003 amazing mystery thriller novel The Da Vinci Code, symbologist Robert Langdon and cryptologist Sophie Neveu are involved in a battle between the Priori of Sion and Opus Dei after a murder in the Louvre Museum in Paris reveals to them, spoiler alert, the possibility of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene having had a child together. But first, there's a crucial bit of math that serves as a key to breaking the code and eventually uncovering the mystery: the divine proportion. Long heralded as the pinnacle of aesthetic beauty, it's been around since the time of the ancient Greeks. First studied by mathematician Euclid, who called it the division and extreme and mean ratio, it has been pored over by many others, including Pythagoras, Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, and Boethius. Through the ages, the golden ratio has gone by many names: golden mean, golden section, and of course, divine proportion. Phi is an irrational number like pi and e, meaning that its terms go on forever after the decimal point without repeating, but it amounts to roughly 1.618. Put simply, two quantities are in the golden ratio if their ratio is the same as the ratio of their sum to the larger of the two quantities. If that still didn't clear up things for you, here's a visual reference you're sure to recognize: the Fibonacci spiral. It's built on the Fibonacci sequence, in which every subsequent number in the sequence is found by adding together the two preceding numbers. And by taking the ratio of successive Fibonacci numbers, you can get closer and closer to phi. Here's what phi looks like when it's geometrically reduced down several times into what are known as golden rectangles. These rectangles can be split into a perfect square and a smaller rectangle that has the same aspect ratio as the rectangle it was cut away from. Phi has built up quite a reputation for itself, but while it's been around for some time, it gained most of its notoriety only in recent centuries. Many wondrous properties have been attributed to phi. It can be found in art, theology, cosmology, nature, architecture, and even financial markets. Flower petals often come in Fibonacci numbers such as 5 or 8, and pine cones grow their seeds outward in spirals of Fibonacci numbers. People have claimed that seashells, such as those of the Nautilus, exhibit properties in which phi lurks. It's seemingly ubiquitous, found in everything from the architecture of the Parthenon in Athens, Greece, to the Great Pyramids in Giza, Egypt. Phi enthusiasts often mention that certain measurements of the Great Pyramid of Giza, such as the length of its base or its height, are in the golden ratio. Others claim that the Greeks used phi in designing the Parthenon or in their beautiful statuary. It was also being said that Da Vinci himself used the golden ratio as a secret math behind his exquisitely beautiful paintings. It's there in the Fibonacci sequence that we see in nature and the galaxies. A recent study even claimed to find a golden ratio in different proportions of the human skull. Some say that the golden ratio could be applied to the human body by taking the height from a person's navel to his toes, then dividing it by the person's total height. Greats like Le Corbusier and Salvador Dali have used the number in their work. In the 20th century, the famous Swiss-French architect Le Corbusier based his modular system of anthropometric proportions on the golden ratio. Dali painted his masterpiece, The Sacrament of the Last Supper, on a canvas shaped like a golden rectangle. And even the Apple, Twitter, and National Geographic logos are all said to incorporate it. It's seemingly everywhere. Or is it really? A lot of the lore that has been built up around phi doesn't really have basis in reality, or at least that's according to John Brownlee, described the golden ratio as the science's biggest myth. Stanford mathematics professor Keith Devlin has worked with the university's psychology department to ask hundreds of students over the years what their favorite rectangle is. And he shows the students collections of rectangles, then asks them to pick out their favorite one. If there were any truth behind the idea that the golden ratio is key to beautiful aesthetics according to him, the students would pick out the rectangle closest to a golden rectangle. But they don't, they pick seemingly at random, and if you ask them to repeat the exercise, they pick different rectangles. But despite this, the concept of the golden ratio never really went away. Photographers in particular seem to have not gotten the memo. There's quite a lot of math and shot composition, and there remains an abundance of articles advocating for the use of the golden ratio over one of the most basic principles in photography, the rule of thirds. It's a rule of thumb that proposes an image should be imagined as divided into 9 equal parts by 2 equally spaced horizontal lines and 2 equally spaced vertical lines, and that important compositional elements should be placed along these lines or their intersections, which looks a little something like this. Proponents of the technique claim that aligning a subject with these points creates more tension, energy, and interest in the composition rather than simply centering the subject. These photos demonstrate the application of the rule of thirds. The subject sits at the intersection of two lines, sometimes called a power point or a crash point. But then in that case, when do we use the golden ratio and when do we use the rule of thirds? Some describe the rule of thirds as basically a simplification of the golden mean, calling the golden ratio the rule of thirds plus some more. Another article claims that adhering to the phi ratio makes the photograph more natural because of its inherent complexity and application at the time of composition, whereas the rule of thirds is relatively simple, and as such, its usage for a picture is done too often and is much more obvious. This apparently is why the golden ratio is considered to be a better principle for creating consistently more natural and well-balanced photos. I decided to try and test this claim out for myself, so I attempted to take around 30 more pictures embodying the two guidelines in use to determine whether one is more aesthetically pleasing than the other. Firstly, to refer to what has already been said on the matter. On the subjectivity of aesthetic beauty, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines the first necessary condition of a judgment of taste as its being essentially subjective. What this means is that the judgment of taste is based on a feeling of pleasure or displeasure. In turn, it is this that distinguishes judgments of taste from empirical judgments. Central examples of judgments of taste are judgments of beauty and ugliness, and these judgments of taste can be about art or nature. So this subjectivist thesis would be overstrict if we interpreted it in an atomistic fashion, so that some subjective response corresponds to every judgment of taste and vice versa. So sometimes one can make a judgment of taste on inductive grounds or on the basis of authority. A more holistic picture of the relation between response and judgment would preserve the spirit of subjectivist doctrine while it would fit our actual lives more accurately. So this subjectivist doctrine needs to be refined in order to deal with the cases of induction and authority, but it must not be abandoned because the doctrine is basically at its core correct. So now on to my own experience. Firstly, in his article for expertphotography.com, Craig Hull still suggests using the rule of thirds for minimal scenarios. He also recommends the golden ratio for more busy scenes. But what I noticed from my photos after taking over 30 photos in and around my house, focusing alternately on the items as a subject for the landscape as the background, and after which I edited and cropped the photo so that it would adhere to either the golden ratio or the rule of thirds, I'd have to disagree with Hull for the most part. I find that using the golden ratio for landscape instead of portrait shots made them, at least in my perspective, more enticing and interesting to look at, since my eye could go around the photo a bit more. I also think that since the phi grid is much more clustered around the middle of the photograph, it can draw marginally more attention to the eye than the rule of thirds might. But generally, I still found the rule of thirds to be unbeatable when it came to shooting subjects up close. Of course, since I'm by no means any expert on photography, even I found the difference to be minimal at best. But generally, the projects I saw similar to the one I did also discovered that this minimal difference could make a huge impact when used right. So that you can see for yourself, here are some more of the photos I took. So on the whole, I'd certainly recommend using the golden ratio and consequently the phi grid for less busy scenes. While phi is certainly an interesting mathematical idea, it is we humans who assign importance to things we find in the universe. The golden mean may not be the representation of perfect beauty, but if it's a way for us to find patterns and seek out meaning in the world, then it's all for the best. But one thing is for certain though, there isn't really a golden rule you can follow all the time. You have to analyze on a case-to-case basis. And that's in keeping with what Giorgio Lupi of Accurat, an Italian design and innovation firm, says. At best, the golden ratio is as important to designers as any other compositional rule, such as the rule of thirds. Maybe a fine rule of thumb, but one that good designers will feel free to reject. Thank you so much for watching.